speedrun every single reason why race is not a biological construct. Based on genetic clusters, the genetic diversity in Africa can explain the genetic diversity of the rest of the world.
While it is true that there's more genetic diversity within Africa than within the rest of the world, not every allele or gene is contained within people of African ancestry. So if your definition of explain is accounts for, then no, the genetic diversity in Africa does not explain the genetic diversity of the rest of the world, as there are genes and alleles that African ancestry does not account for.
Now, the data that goes into making genetic clusters really is continuous and is best explained by a gradient. You can only make genetic clusters look discrete if you choose very small sample sizes and you force the data to conform to discrete categories that you provide to the structure plot program.
This is sort of true, but it doesn't mean what you think it means. For one, when you select for people with monoracial ancestry, the gaps in genetic variation are discontinuous. And while it is true that human genetic variation is continuous, to say continuous variation therefore no races or continuous variation therefore no discrete categorizations can be made would be the continuum fallacy. Categories like black and white aren't suddenly invalid because of mixed individuals in the same way that the existence of green doesn't invalidate the existence of blue and yellow. Additionally, continuous variation does not preclude a subspecies categorization, as there are animals with uncontroversially recognized subspecies that have continuous genetic variation and that follow a genetic distance to genetic variation correlation very similarly to humans. Heck, there are even species that have continuous variation between them and other species. So no, the continuous variation found between human populations does not preclude those populations from rising to the level of subspecies any more than the continuous variation on the color spectrum prevents us from using words like red or green. Also, any animal, even if they have subspecies, that you put into the structured plot program will need you to provide the number of categories regardless of their genetic variation. So saying that you must provide the clusters to the program, therefore no races in humans, would also apply to literally every animal, which is absurd.
Now, genetic clusters are a little different from markers of genetic ancestry, which refers to specific genetic markers known as haplogroups that are passed down from parent to child. Similar to genetic clusters, genetic ancestry does not align with discrete racial categories and is best described as continuous.
Okay, there are some things in here that are just factually wrong. Markers of genetic ancestry does not necessarily refer to haplogroups. Your genetic ancestry is just all the segments of your DNA that you inherited. While your haplogroups are indeed markers of your genetic ancestry, less than 1% of your inherited DNA is contained in your haplogroups, with the other 99% being autosomal DNA. So if you want to best capture genetic ancestry, haplogroups are not what you would choose to do this. Autosomal markers of genetic ancestry are much more comprehensive in capturing genetic ancestry than haplogroup markers of genetic ancestry, which is why companies like 23andMe use autosomal markers to get the results, not haplogroups. So when you show a map of haplogroups and claim it's a map of genetic ancestry, you're displaying only a narrow part of human genetic ancestry. Haplogroup maps represent individual patrilineal or matrilineal lines, not overall genetic ancestry. Conflating haplogroups with genetic ancestry misrepresents the scope of what genetic ancestry means. And again, this is the continuum fallacy. Continuous variation does not preclude the existence of categories on that continuum.
And the haplogroups that describe genetic ancestry are not even involved in the way that your hair and skin looks, so you cannot tell someone's genetic ancestry simply by looking at them.
While it's true that haplogroups aren't really involved in the way your hair and skin look, you are once again conflating genetic ancestry with haplogroup. The inherited autosomal DNA in your genome is indeed part of your genetic ancestry and does in fact affect the way your hair and skin look. Additionally, it is possible to determine someone's race or continental ancestry with high accuracy just by looking at them. In studies looking at how well social classification of race based on things like skin color lines up with best fit genetic cluster, we find that accurate classifications occur nearly 100% of the time, showing that it is possible to determine someone's continental ancestry with high accuracy just by looking at them. This and similar findings can be found in studies like Guo 2015, Oloco 2007, Rich 2002, and Bamshed 2003.
We all have a little bit of Neanderthal DNA, but the populations with the most Neanderthal DNA are actually Europeans and Asians.
Well, kinda. There are people in sub-Saharan Africa with virtually zero Neanderthal DNA, as you can see in this graph from Haber et al. 2016. The sub-Saharan populations in Chad are extremely close to 0% Neanderthal DNA. If they do have some, it's probably a figure like 0.00001%. And yes, the populations with the most Neanderthal DNA are Europeans and Asians. However, I don't know anyone who uses this to define races. It's just that the races differ in the rates at which they have Neanderthal DNA.
Skin color is polygenic and is predicated on UVB exposure, so two people may have a similar skin tone, but have that similar skin tone for two completely different genetic reasons.
This is true, but it doesn't really matter for race. That's because the phenotypic traits used to classify humans into races don't just include skin color, but also skull morphology, nose shape, eye shape, ear shape, lip size, etc. This is why you can tell the races of the individuals in this photo, even though they all have relatively the same hair and skin color.
HLA haplotype is used to find matches for bone marrow and organ transplants, not race. HLA haplotype does not describe race, and the overemphasis of race in determining HLA haplotype can result in racial disparities and transplant mismatches.
True, but this doesn't really matter for racial classification.
Racial differences in IQ and brain volume are primarily a product of racial disparities in socioeconomic variables such as household income, maternal and fetal malnutrition, childhood deprivation, and a discriminatory educational environment. When you account for all of these variables, racial differences in IQ and brain volume disappear.
Okay, this is a pretty gritty topic, but the data we have does not show what you're saying. Firstly, in a survey of intelligence researchers, Rinderman et al. 2013 found that the median response of intelligence researchers when asked about the heritability of the black-white IQ gap was 50%. In the only transracial adoption IQ study ever done, the black adoptees still lag behind the white adoptees by 15 IQ points. Now, there is very obviously some confounding in this study, but it just goes to show that it's not as simple as controlling for socioeconomic factors. When you look at SAT scores controlling for household income and race, there's around a 160-point gap. This leads to white students in the $20,000 to $40,000 a year income bracket scoring higher than blacks, even if the black students make more than $200,000 a year. This pattern persists for criminality too, as shown here. Even African Americans that make more than $85,000 a year have higher homicide rates than whites making less than $10,000 a year. This strongly suggests that economic factors don't have as much influence as one might assume. Also, we shouldn't assume as our starting point the idea that all the races are equal in their mental traits. For one, we know that the races develop genetic differences in things like skin color, hair color, sickle cell trait, adult lactose tolerance, body shape, etc. If the races are genetically equal in respect to the psychological traits, but somehow different in all these other ones, it would be nothing short of an evolutionary miracle. The study, modeling the 3D geometry of the cortical surface of the genetic ancestry by Fan et al. 2016, found that the unique folding patterns of gyri and sulci are closely aligned with genetic ancestry. Not only this, but a study titled Different Level of Population Differentiation Among Human Genes by Wu and Zhang in 2011 found that human populations differ more in genes that code for the structure of the brain than in genes that determine skin color. The supposition that, unlike the racial differences that are found in the other parts of the body, these differences are due entirely to the environment is obviously a political one. Now, even if population level means differ, that tells us nothing about specific individuals, but your idea that you can just control for a few variables and the gaps go away is not really what we find.
Athletic sprinter genotypes that encode for quick and powerful muscles like the actin N3R genotype can be found across many different races. Societal support and acceptance drives athleticism in particular countries.
I'm not going to get too deep into the sprinting stuff since I don't really think it matters, but if you want to see a video on that, tell me in the comments. Now, I will say this. The first black sprinter to break 10 seconds in the 100-meter dash was Jim Hines in 1968. The first white sprinter to break 10 seconds in the 100-meter dash was Christophe Lemaitre in 2010. By then, more than 200 black men had already broken 10 seconds in the 100-meter dash, many of which came from poor African countries. Are we really going to say that this discrepancy is entirely predicated on some sort of nebulous cultural factor?
Race-associated diseases like sickle cell disease are just associated based on stereotypes.
This statement is just factually wrong. The reason people associate sickle cell with certain races is because certain races have sickle cell at way higher rates. 9% of black people in America carry the sickle cell trait, while only 0.2% of white Americans carry the trait. It's not associated based on stereotypes. There's literally just a higher rate of black people with sickle cell trait.
In reality, these diseases occur at a higher prevalence in specific geographic areas due to specific environmental variables, such as malaria-carrying mosquitoes, where individuals without sickle cell disease carry one copy of the sickle cell trait, are protected from malaria but are more likely to give birth to a child with sickle cell disease. This is why the prevalence of sickle cell disease is high in sub-Saharan Africa, South India, and Brazil, even though they all have different markers of genetic ancestry.
This is not the case. If there is a population in a geographic region with high rates of sickle cell trait, that doesn't necessarily mean that the environmental factors that region has are the reason why that is the case. Take, for instance, Brazil. The reason Brazil has high rates of sickle cell trait is not because of the environment there. It's because there's a large population of people with African ancestry there. In fact, Brazil has the largest black population outside of Africa. If the environment was the case, native Brazilians would have developed high rates of the trait independently, but they didn't. They only developed it after Europeans and Africans came with the trait.
Finally, based on over 2 million pharmacogenomic variants and approximately 2 million common genetic variants overall, there's between 93 and 97% genetic differences within races.
Firstly, within race genetic variation has found to be 85 to 90%, not 90 to 97%. If you read the first sentence of the abstract of the paper you cited, you would see that. Now, after you noted the amount of genetic variation within races, you didn't say anything about what that means for whether or not races exist, so I just have to assume what you implied. I think you're implying that there's not enough genetic variation among humans for there to be racial groups, or that there's more variation within racial groups than between racial groups, meaning that you can't have racial groups for some reason. Now, both of those reasons are faulty. There's no objective minimum amount of variation you need to have subspecies within a species. There's plenty of non-human animals that have subspecies that also have a similar amount of genetic variation to humans. And more variation within than between is just Lewontin's fallacy. There's no reason that more variation within than between means that you can't make meaningful taxonomic classifications. Take a look at our good friend the chimpanzee. There's more variation within chimpanzee subspecies than between chimpanzee subspecies. Are you going to therefore deny the existence of subspecies in chimps like you would in humans? No, you obviously wouldn't, which is why this critique is stupid, and no population geneticist takes it seriously. Finally, I want to address the ethical objections Scientific Snitch has to those that oppose race denial. To that point, I'll just say this. Radical blank slatism in the form of Lysenkoism in the USSR and Maoist China probably contributed to the deaths of more people than simple racial naturalism ever has. That doesn't necessarily mean that race denial is false, but it also doesn't mean you can point to some bad people or regimes with vaguely racial naturalist beliefs to say that racial naturalism is false. At the end of the day, this is all just poisoning the well. It would be better for science as a whole if we could just discuss these topics without having to call each other names or invoke the crimes of historical regimes.